Freedom is celebrated in speeches across the world. Yet when Africa dares to claim its own, suspicion rises like a shadow. This paradox is not new. For centuries, African resources have been extracted, its labor undervalued, and its voice muted. But now, in an age where the invisible wealth of data rivals gold and oil, the demand for sovereignty has returned with new fire. Picture a land where every email, every payment, and every search has long traveled thousands of miles through foreign servers before circling back home. This was not efficiency. It was dependence dressed as progress. And into this silence stepped a young leader, Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, declaring that sovereignty must extend beyond soil and mines into the fiber beneath our feet and the code that shapes our daily lives. His words are more than a call. They are a challenge to the order of things. If one small nation dares to plant the seed of digital independence, could it grow into a forest that changes the world? Stay with us. This is more than a headline. It is a hinge in history. Subscribe to Stand with the Story. For decades, Africa's digital story was not written in Accra, Nairobi, or Ouagadougou. It was written in Seattle, Paris, and Silicon Valley. Every message, every online transaction, every search query traveled across oceans, looping through servers thousands of miles away, before returning to the very same continent where it had begun. Imagine sending a letter to your neighbor's house, but first mailing it across the Atlantic. That was the daily, digital reality for over 1 billion people. This design was never neutral. It carried a cost, one that drained African households and economies. Families in Burkina Faso spent a disproportionate share of their income just to keep children connected for school. Students in Nairobi waited long minutes for a single download that would take seconds in London. Businesses in Lagos paid inflated fees to foreign cloud services. Meanwhile, American corporations collected billions in profit year after year. The consequences stretched beyond money. They reached into power itself. Search engines elevated Western histories while silencing African legacies. A student curious about the Mali Empire often found more about Napoleon than about their own continent's dynasties. Knowledge, influence, and cultural pride were routed away along with the data. What was promised as a borderless commons turned into a toll road, and Africans were charged the highest price to use it. It was in this context that Ibrahim Traoré, newly risen as the president of Burkina Faso in late 2022, uttered words that startled even his allies. Sovereignty, he declared, could not stop at land or gold. It had to include information, knowledge, and the networks that carried them. His message resonated across the continent because it spoke to a wound felt everywhere: the quiet humiliation of being digitally dependent. The idea was audacious: build Africa's own internet exchange, lay 100,000 kilometers of fiber, construct 47 data centers across deserts, jungles, and cities, create a protocol incompatible with Silicon Valley's monopoly. For skeptics, it sounded like fantasy. How could a continent often dismissed as fragmented and underdeveloped manage a project that even trillion-dollar corporations struggled to maintain? Yet beneath the doubt, belief spread. Engineers in Dakar, policymakers in Addis Ababa, and students in Nairobi began to imagine an alternative future. It was not just about faster Wi-Fi. It was about dignity. The dignity of knowing that African voices would no longer be filtered through distant algorithms, that African wealth would circulate within African economies, and that African children would grow up connected to their own histories rather than reduced to footnotes in someone else's. History had long offered Africa only two paths: submit quietly to foreign systems, or risk everything to build anew. Traore placed his people before that same choice: dependence, predictable, familiar, safe, but perpetual subordination, or freedom, costly, uncertain, risky, but carrying the promise of dignity and control. The first cables were laid quietly, winding beneath the soil like seeds waiting for the rains. The vision was fragile, questioned at every turn, yet it carried a momentum that no critic could fully extinguish because, at its heart, it was more than technology. It was memory and pride, the echo of past generations who had resisted chains, whether of iron or of code. And so the stage was set. Africa's digital future hung in the balance. The question was not simply whether fiber could be buried or servers could be built. It was whether a continent long defined by dependency could finally redraw the map of power in the invisible highways of the 21st century. But could one continent really flip the switch against Silicon Valley? The vision of a sovereign African internet might have begun as words, but soon it transformed into concrete action. Across deserts and savannas, beneath crowded streets and quiet villages, cables were laid like veins of a new body. 100,000 kilometers of fiber stitched together a continent that had too often been portrayed as divided. 47 data centers rose, humming with energy, like fortresses of knowledge and independence. And then, the day arrived. The switch was flipped. In that instant, history bent. Within hours, millions connected. Within days, over 200 million Africans migrated to the new system. No technology platform in history, not Facebook, not TikTok, not WhatsApp, had ever seen adoption on such a scale, so quickly. It was not a gradual rise. It was an eruption. The reaction was immediate, and it was global. In Silicon Valley, panic spread. Executives at Google, Microsoft, and Amazon convened emergency meetings. The problem was not only competition. The African protocol had been built to be incompatible. Google's crawlers could not index it. Microsoft's cloud could not penetrate it. The monopoly, nurtured for decades, was broken at its root. In Washington, policymakers debated furiously. Could this be framed as a threat to global security? Could sanctions be justified under the banner of digital stability? In Paris and London, analysts spoke of fragmentation, as if Africa's independence was not a right, but a danger to the order of things. For nations accustomed to setting the rules, the sight of Africa writing its own was unsettling. Yet on the streets of Ouagadougou, Nairobi, and Lagos, the mood was different. Students streamed lectures without interruption. Entrepreneurs processed payments without detours through foreign servers. Farmers checked market prices in real time, bypassing exploitative tolls. To them, the revolution was not abstract geopolitics. It was bread on the table, opportunity in the market, dignity in daily life. Social media became a battlefield of its own. Hashtags like #AfricaConnected, Sovereignty Now, and #Traore Vision surged across platforms. Short videos compared the old internet routes, data looping thousands of miles through Europe, with the new direct African pathways. The message spread like wildfire. Africa had never been loyal to Western platforms. It had been trapped by lack of choice. Now given an alternative, it walked out on them. Still, freedom never comes without a fight. Lobbyists from Western corporations swarmed African capitals, warning of chaos and instability. Editorials in major Western newspapers painted the move as reckless, even dangerous. Local critics voiced fears. Could Africa's infrastructure handle billions of daily transactions? Could universities and engineers sustain what trillion-dollar companies had long monopolized? Doubt lingered. and fear whispered in the background. But in the silence of doubt, the hum of the new network continued. Cables pulsed with data. Servers stored African knowledge in African languages. And the vision of sovereignty gained a heartbeat of its own. Traore stood before his people and declared, "Dependence ends the day we decide it ends." His words were not just spoken. They were lived in the fiber beneath their soil and the screens in their hands. This was the climax, not of conflict with tanks and guns, but of wires and code. A continent that had once been told it was too fragmented, too poor, too dependent, had risen to its feet and chosen risk over submission. The ripple was felt not just in Africa, but across the world. Yet freedom never comes without resistance. Who would strike back first? When the dust of the launch settled, the question was no longer whether Africa could build its own internet. The cables were real. The data centers were alive. The people were connected. The question now became, what would this mean for the daily lives of millions and for the political future of the continent? For the farmer in Bobo Dioulasso, the impact was immediate. With faster and cheaper access to digital platforms built locally, he could sell crops directly in regional markets, bypassing exploitative middlemen who once dictated prices. A secure payment app developed in Ouagadougou allowed him to receive money instantly from buyers in Ghana. For the first time, he was not only growing food, but reaping fair value. For a family in rural Burkina Faso, internet bills no longer devoured the household budget. Children could join online classes without forcing parents to choose between groceries and connectivity. The sense of relief was tangible. Internet access had stopped being a luxury and become a basic right. In Nairobi, students discovered a new reality in their search bars. When typing Mali Empire, they were met not with foreign summaries, but with African scholarship, digitized oral histories, and perspectives written in their own languages. The shift was not only technological, it was psychological. It whispered a message long denied. African knowledge matters, and African voices lead their own narrative. The political consequences were equally profound. For Ibrahim Traoré, the gamble transformed into legitimacy. In a continent weary of empty slogans, he had turned rhetoric into infrastructure, promises into cables, words into lived experience. His speeches about dignity and sovereignty now carried the weight of proof. To young Africans, he was no longer simply a leader. He was a symbol of what their generation could dare to achieve. But sovereignty is never a gift. It is a discipline, a burden, a constant defense. Governments across the continent faced new responsibilities. Civil society warned that the same infrastructure freeing Africans from Silicon Valley must not be turned into a tool for censorship at home. The challenge had shifted. Independence had been won, but liberty still had to be preserved. Economically, the numbers spoke for themselves. $50 billion, once drained each year into Western cloud services, now circulated within African economies. That wealth funded local startups, created jobs for engineers, and seeded innovation ecosystems in cities from Accra to Addis Ababa. The brain drain began to slow as skilled graduates found opportunities within their own nations. For the first time in decades, Africa was not just exporting talent, it was cultivating it. Yet beneath the triumph, tensions remained. Old powers did not watch quietly as revenue streams dried and influence eroded. Lobbying intensified, diplomatic pressure mounted, and the specter of sanctions loomed. The story of independence was not a final chapter. It was a beginning, and every beginning is fragile. Still, the symbolism was undeniable. For centuries, Africa's wealth, gold, cotton, oil, cocoa, had flowed outward. enriching others while impoverishing its own. Now, even the invisible wealth of data was being reclaimed. This was more than technology. It was the essence of an idea. Anti-colonial Africa, a continent refusing to remain defined by dependence, choosing instead to build dignity into its own architecture. The road ahead was uncertain, but on the streets of Ouagadougou, the air was thick with pride. Young people painted murals with slogans like "Our data, our destiny." Each brushstroke was a declaration that history was shifting, not in distant capitals, but in the hands of those who once had none. But would sovereignty hold when old powers pushed back harder? The reverberations of Africa's digital leap did not stop at its borders. In Washington, alarm bells rang. Congressional hearings framed the new African Internet exchange as a potential risk to global stability. Lobbyists from Silicon Valley warned that incompatibility with American systems could weaken cybersecurity and commerce. Yet behind the rhetoric lay a more fragile fear. The United States had lost leverage over the continent's most vital networks. In Paris, the anxiety was more cultural than technical. For decades, France had prided itself on shaping narratives in its former colonies through language, media, and education. Now, with African search engines prioritizing African knowledge, the influence of Parisian publishers and broadcasters began to fade. Editorials in French newspapers fretted that Africa was drifting away. In London, similar concerns echoed, couched in the language of global cooperation, but underscored by a sense of diminished authority. But beyond the Atlantic, the view was different. In South America, leaders studied the African model closely. Some even spoke publicly about creating their own continental network, free from dependence on North America. In Asia, governments that had already experimented with regional internet systems pointed to Africa as proof that digital sovereignty was not a utopian dream, but a tangible reality. The African Union, emboldened by the success, declared that a sovereign digital future is not optional, it is necessary. Regional blocs like ECOWAS and SADC debated how to align policies and infrastructure, envisioning a more connected continent where trade and communication could flourish without foreign tolls. The sense of possibility was electric. Still, critics in the West painted a darker picture. Analysts spoke of the balkanization of the Internet, warning of fragmentation and division. Think tanks issued reports predicting instability, cyber vulnerabilities, even the risk of authoritarian misuse. To some, African independence was not an achievement to applaud, but a challenge to be contained. Yet the truth was simpler. What had emerged was not chaos, but choice. For the first time in digital history, Africa was no longer a tenant in someone else's system, but an architect of its own. This was not isolationism. It was a rebalancing, a step toward dignity. And in that sense, the story of Africa was also the story of every nation struggling to define its place in a world where power is hidden in cables, servers, and algorithms. The phrase echoed across speeches and headlines. African sovereignty. It was not a slogan anymore. It was lived reality, embedded in infrastructure, and defended by people who refused to be invisible. Was this the dawn of a multipolar internet, or the start of a new Cold War online? The launch of Africa's sovereign internet was not an end. It was a beginning. With cables beneath the soil and servers rising across capitals, the question shifted from, can Africa build this? To, what will Africa make of this? The answer lay not only in technology, but in choices yet to be made. On one hand, the opportunities were immense. Local startups now had fertile ground to grow. nourished by infrastructure that kept wealth circulating within the continent. Young coders in Lagos could design apps reaching millions of neighbors instantly, no longer buried under foreign platforms. Farmers could sell crops across borders with fairer prices, while teachers in remote villages streamed lessons without interruption. Sovereignty was no longer a distant promise. It was felt in the pulse of daily life. Culturally, the shift was profound. For centuries, the stories of Africa had been filtered through outside voices. Now, African languages, oral histories, and scholarship were prioritized in their own digital space. The preservation of identity was no longer only a matter of memory. It was woven into the very architecture of the network. But the path ahead was not without peril. Independence demanded vigilance. Civil society groups warned that governments must resist the temptation to use new control as a weapon against dissent. The danger was clear. The same cables that empowered could also imprison if misused. The challenge was not just to claim sovereignty, but to protect liberty within it. Internationally, pressure would continue. Western corporations, stripped of revenue, would not accept loss quietly. Diplomatic campaigns and economic threats loomed, each designed to push Africa back into dependence. The resilience of this new order would be tested again and again. Still, a sense of momentum carried the continent forward. In Ouagadougou, murals proclaimed, "Our data, our destiny." In Nairobi, university students spoke with pride about being the first generation to study through systems built for them, not for someone else. In Accra, entrepreneurs dreamed of exporting African-designed platforms to the world. The future, for once, was not only imagined abroad, it was being written at home. The road ahead will demand discipline, courage, and unity. It will require that sovereignty not become a slogan, but remain a practice, defended in law, technology, and culture. The question is no longer whether Africa can build, but whether Africa can endure, whether it can turn the seed of independence into a harvest of dignity for generations to come. The choice before Africa is clear, but will the world accept it? The story of Africa's sovereign internet is not simply about fiber and code. It is about dignity. For too long, the continent's wealth, both visible and invisible, flowed outward. Gold, cocoa, cotton, oil, and even the data of everyday lives left African soil to enrich others. But with the rise of a continental network, that flow began to reverse. Wealth, knowledge, and opportunity now circulate within, strengthening roots that had long been neglected. The image is powerful. Picture the lights of Ouagadougou glowing against the night sky, while beneath the earth, cables pulse like roots, carrying nourishment through the body of a continent. These are not just wires, they are arteries of independence, proof that sovereignty can be built into the very infrastructure of life. For Ibrahim Traoré and his generation, the lesson is clear. Sovereignty is not a slogan, it is a discipline. It demands sacrifice, risk, and constant vigilance, but it also brings reward. The pride of knowing that Africa no longer waits for permission, that Africa can be the author of its own destiny. This moment is more than African. It is universal. In a world shaken by pandemics, cyber threats, and economic shocks, every nation must ask, who controls our data? Who shapes our knowledge? Who defines our future? If Africa can reclaim control, then so can others. What began as a cry for independence in Ouagadougou may yet echo across continents. The old order called this reckless, but to millions of young Africans, it is justice long delayed. They chant it in streets and share it online. Our hands, our life, our future. The spirit of anti-colonial Africa has found new life, not in speeches alone, but in servers and cables. The dream of African sovereignty has moved from rhetoric to reality. And so we return to the question: if one small, landlocked nation can take back control, what stops the rest? The answer lies not in distant capitals, but in the choices of people everywhere. Dependence or dignity, silence or voice, safety or freedom. If this journey touched you, carry it forward. Share, comment, and subscribe. Together, we can ensure that the story of Africa's new chapter is not forgotten but remembered as the seed of a wider harvest of freedom.